Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to PyData Daily Meetup 43. We are extremely sorry for the delay because of some technical glitch, but yeah, let's move forward. And so let me just give you a brief about about today's meetup. Like it's a kind of we have advertised everywhere that it's going to be a podcast, and we're trying a different format. So usually, we have meetups where presenter or speakers comes and they talk about technical topics and stuff. So but there are not a lot of I would say meetups or online gatherings where you get to see the uh, behind the scenes or how the what personality does a speaker or presenter have. So we kind of like thought to experiment with this format and invite Deven. So interestingly, Deven was one of the first speakers for our online meetup we did back in April 2021, since the start of the pandemic and all. So it was just it was very logical to bring him for the new format, for the inaugural of the new format. And Deven is also a very good friend of mine. So yeah, let's see how it goes. So I'm gonna be the host for this podcast series, and Deven is the guest. And we also have Arsh with us. He's a good friend of mine, and I think most of you know that he has been doing PyData volunteer work for the starting since the inception of PyData. So he may be jumping for some cool questions and stuff. So yeah, so let me just start about a little bit intro about what PyData is and all. So we use basically a couple of very famous data science tools we use in our day-to-day life for doing our work, like Pandas, NumPy, Scikit-learn, Matplotlib. And these tools need constant support, donations, and help to run them sustainably. So this is where a nonprofit focus steps in, and they help these tools. And PyData is basically educational initiative by focus. And so we are like one of the 180 chapters all over the world, and we are like currently fourth largest and doing cool stuff since the last 4.5 years. And yeah, that's about PyData. So a little bit about me. My name is Sanket Verma, and I have been with PyData for the last 4 years. And since then, I've had wonderful volunteers and friends with me, which helped me organize meetups and conferences and stuff. So sadly, we didn't have conference last year, or I don't think so. We're gonna have this year, but yeah, meetups have been going since then. And yeah, it's fun and we learn a lot. And yeah, so, Devin, would you like to give us a short intro about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, hey everyone. My name is Deven Desai. I am currently the head of product at AtlasAI, and we are a startup based out of Palo Alto, California. The Well, I guess yeah, I can probably just give a little bit of background into Atlas before I talk a little bit about myself. Um, Atlas was founded by three professors at Stanford who decided to try to focus on a couple of things. One, just better understanding how agricultural productivity can improve in areas where there is limited data today and limited ground truth collection. And then also the other side of it was how does that affect development economics and how can you actually improve the economical livelihood of a variety of people that are in the emerging markets and also in the frontier markets. So think like a lot of economies that are yet to actually grow into like the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% GDP growth per year over year. Those that are actually making their way into that situation, how do you make sure they're prepared to sustain that growth and make sure that their populace can actually have the right economic livelihood gains, similar to kind of how India and China and Brazil and all the other countries have been kind of dealing with growth for like the last 20, 25 years, kind of the situation. So that's a little bit about Atlas AI. A big part of what we do has to do with using alternative data sets that are kind of now mainstream, but back in the day were pretty alternative, particularly satellite imagery. And to make sure that you can combine that with surveyed statistics that actually come through from both the United Nations and from other nation states, and to make sure that you actually correlate the things correctly. So instead of having, for example, population that's just an average spread across a particular district, actually trying to understand where buildings are and settlements are, and then trying to associate populations to those locations instead of an empty field where there might be a point with like 6 people on it. So
Yeah.
that's a bit about Atlas. A bit about myself. I've been here for about a year, so I think the last time Sanket, you and I spoke, I was
Yeah.
actually at the other company, Planet Labs, and of course I have way too much of their merchandise in my closet.
Yeah, I
Therefore,
can see that.
yeah, this is from the 2019 Explorer conference that Planet had hosted.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Planet Labs is more, call it the producer of said satellite imagery, whereas now I'm currently the consumer side. I am the one that
Hmm.
receives it. But when I was at Planet, I started when it was a lot smaller of a company with a much more audacious mission, at least at that time. The goal at that time was to hit something called Mission One, which was, can we as humanity put enough satellites in space to image the Earth every day
Hmm.
nonstop with at least 90% geographic coverage of landmass, right?
Okay.
This is something that wasn't possible before. And prior to that, the goal had been, I think, by NASA and ESA to cover the entire Earth on an average of like, a 4 to 5 day rotation in the case of the European Space Agency, which
Hmm.
started its Sentinel program. And in the case of NASA, since like the 70s, they've been imaging quite a bit, but like the
Yeah.
cadence has been a lot slower. And in the 90s, 2000s, the goal was once every 14 days. Well, things change a lot
Okay.
faster than once every two
Yeah.
weeks. And so the goal was, can we do it every day? And also, can we do it for a resolution that's like 100 times better than what
Hmm.
NASA provides, right? So that was kind of the goal of Planet. Which made it for a nice shoe in for me to come into here at AtlasAI. And before
Yeah.
that, I did a lot more boring stuff related to management consulting and technical consulting for e-commerce companies. But yeah, that's a bit about me.
Yeah, like that's an interesting journey. Like you and I usually have chat sometime. Like we hop on a call and we know about stuff. So yeah, I mean, Deven's been doing exciting and interesting stuff since he was like born. So
I don't know about that, but I will appreciate the compliment.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, I mean, so the all the people present here, they are big fans of Planet Labs and all this space stuff and satellites. So they are very into these stuff. So uh, So I basically did some background research about like what Atlas AI does and all. So I just want to know like why does Atlas focuses like more on Africa? Like is there some untapped potential over there that Atlas is focusing on, or are there number of problems which are not in United States or any other countries in the world which Atlas focus on?
Yeah, so I'll focus on two things. One, the
Hmm.
pragmatic reasons for why Atlas operates and does a lot of its data production in Africa, and
Hmm.
also just why we chose to build our platform out with Africa as our first test bed. And then the second bit is less pragmatic and kind of the like untapped economic potential, if you will, or why not focus on US or Europe. So for the
Hmm.
first bit, the reason this whole thing started is because those three professors that I mentioned,
Yeah.
you have David Lebel, you have Stefano Orman, and you also have Marshall Burke. All three of these professors are really, really well known within their fields. So
Okay.
respectively, Stefano in computer science. You have David Lebel, who I think Reuters just came out with a post of the top 1,000 climate scientists, and David Lebel's
Okay.
number 11 on that list. So yeah,
Oh, I
fairly
didn't know
well
that.
known.
I
Yeah,
didn't
I
know.
didn't know that until last night when I looked at this and I was like, oh, interesting.
Okay.
Um,
You okay.
yeah, and then
Hmm.
Marshall Burke has been cited 1.5 million times, not literally, but quite a bit in the development economics community. Pretty much
Hmm.
anyone we
Okay.
meet at the World Bank, anyone we meet in the higher ends of development finance knows of Marshall Burke, and so
Okay.
all these professors had a problem they wanted to explore, which was how can we offer the same kinds of granular agricultural productivity information to
Hmm.
smallholder farmers or to communities like cooperatives and stuff that don't actually have the means to interpret satellite imagery, to understand how things are actually captured, and to process
Hmm.
that satellite data. And then also like even larger, cooperatives or governments themselves who might need to better understand it for import-export policy reasons, right? Like, hey,
Okay.
the western part of Kenya, for example, has not grown maize to the degree that we expected, and we're probably going to need to import more maize for food security reasons for our country or something like that. Or there was a
Okay.
locust devastation, and it, decimated, the like 64% of the fields in the 7 like counties or sub-counties within, Kenya or something like that. So they went on a research project. They flew to the western parts of Kenya. They manually
Okay.
went into fields and cut crops because you have to do crop cuts in order to get ground truth data. They tried to understand how things are affected by weather, climatologically speaking, over time, what happens. And then also across the course of a growing cycle or two, they collected like thousands of data points. And then they flew back to the United States. And they're like, okay, how can we work with a bunch of these new satellite companies that are coming around? And how can we get some free data from them in order to kind of connect the dots? Can we take the
Okay.
observations we had on the ground to match them to how indices look like from satellite imagery in space? And, when we say satellite imagery, we're talking about not just red, green, and blue pixels like the way we video conference right now or the way we take photographs. There are much more important data sets that actually get captured through the sensors that are on these satellites, particularly in the near infrared band that help you understand things around vegetation quality, and also just like the level of growth that's been occurring over time. And so this has been around for a long time. This is not like net new stuff, but the frequency at which the data is collected is certainly a net new phenomenon since like last, call it like 4 or 5 years, right? This is the going from every 2 weeks to every day kind of a situation, right? So published a paper, things were great. Eventually this nonprofit called the Rockefeller Foundation said, hey, instead of just publishing this paper and putting it in a journal and then leaving it to rot on some shelf somewhere, virtually speaking, how about you actually turn it into a business? Maybe like this is something that's required and we're happy to seed you a little bit of money. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, but like, let's give this a try. And so they created AtlasAI about 2-ish years ago with the explicit goal of trying to understand agricultural productivity in emerging markets and frontier markets. From there, it expanded, right? So obviously, if the research was done in Africa and certainly sub-Saharan Africa, clearly the business was going to take off from that particular location on Earth as well. So from there, I think the goal became, how can we do continent-wide economic statistics? How can we do continent-wide agricultural statistics as like the next geographic expansion for the company, right? I think the goal is to be global, but not global for the United States and Europe, but for all emerging and frontier markets around the world, right? So that's kind of the intention here, which I think is a perfect segue for the second part, which is like, why aren't we doing this in US or Europe? And again, the pragmatic answer is a lot of what we do already exists in the United States and Europe. It's been built over the last 15 years, and it's built on infrastructure that's in the public domain, right? Like NASA spends billions of dollars, like to put these satellites into space, and then they don't make money off of it. It's for public service. It's every single image that's taken by a Landsat satellite is given to the public. And so it was much easier, and that's just one example, right? But it's much easier to have startups come out to do the same kinds of things we're doing when you have a Bureau of Labor and Statistics, when you have the Securities and Exchange Commission that's actually tracking every single company that's trying to go public and all the financials are reported. Like you have information out there, and just recently you've had the ability to use data science in order to coalesce that information, sort that information, clean it up, and then actually run calculations en masse, right? So all of that exists in the Western world. Why would we be just another company that does that as well, right? Like there's no competitive advantage for us. And so we decided to take the more challenging route, which was let's go to a place where data doesn't exist, where it's quite sparse. And let's actually be the first mover there. Let's start collecting large amounts of training data. Let's start collecting large amounts of information that gives us the competitive advantage so that if any of the larger companies that already operate in the United States, Western Europe try to come in, it's a lot harder for them to compete in this market. Secondly, there is another mission to AtlasAI, right? So the official name of the company is AtlasAI PBC. That last three acronym matters: Public Benefit Corporation, right?
Oh, okay.
So
I was wondering about this thing because yesterday I was posting on LinkedIn. So everywhere it's atlasai.co. And on LinkedIn it's atlasai/PBC. I was like, okay, what was that?
yeah. So the PBC is like a denomination that's, I think, unique to the US, maybe to a few other countries. It denotes that like you're a public benefit corporation, meaning you have
Okay.
like slightly altruistic goal of existing as a business. You're
Hmm.
a large part of the things you do are also there to like benefit the general public. Normally it's given to
Oh,
just
okay.
like nonprofits or things like that, but it's not uncommon for, I think, mission-driven companies to also have it, right? So for us, the
Okay.
goal is, as a public benefit corporation, to build a community and an ecosystem that actually can make use of this data and actually do the things. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about a couple of the use cases, but like
Yeah.
our work with the World Bank has been phenomenal in trying to make sure that we're actually able to direct cash transfers and money to the places it actually needs to go.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, that's a good question. So we should probably talk about resolution for a second. So normally, when we talk about resolution in a consumer mindset, we always say, oh, it's a 12 megapixel camera, it's a 5 megapixel camera, oh, it's a 100 megapixel zoom, whatever. Like those are, I think, excellent proxies to use when you're talking about consumer devices. But in the remote sensing world, resolution, as I'm sure you know, Arsh, is done in meters per pixel. Sometimes back in the day it was kilometers per pixel, but it's actually the general proxy measurement here is meters per pixel. It's to say for every pixel that's shown in a given image, how many meters in one direction of that square pixel does it actually represent on the ground. And so you can imagine that NASA has been flying a lot of these birds, call it Landsat 8 as the most recent one, and 9 and 10 are about to go up. They do 30 meters per pixel, right? So for every pixel that you observe, it's about 30 meters. Sentinel does about 10 meters per pixel for most of the nanometer wavelengths, if I'm not mistaken, and most of the like electro-optical sensors. And then Planet does or tries to do 3 meters per pixel, right? And so depending on the kind of data set you're purchasing from Planet, the processing that's been done, it can bump up to 4.7 meters as well. But it's supposed to be an order of magnitude improvement from the Landsat satellites. There's also a high resolution component here, Earth, right? So there are tasking satellites instead of monitoring satellites, where you ask the satellite or you ask the platform, and it will point to a particular location and click a much more higher resolution image. That has been capped by the United States, at least, or any company that operates commercially in the United States, to 30 centimeters. You want to go below that, you have to get a very special license. The big change that's occurred is less to do with how good the resolution is, but how frequently the temporal coverage is. And so it's totally okay to have 3 meters per pixel, which is pretty effing good, but to capture it on a daily basis to understand climatological change for any given field that's been happening for any given growing season. And that's way more important than trying to capture like 50 centimeter data or 30 centimeter data. And in this case, yes, it means that a pixel represents 50 centimeters on the ground. So we're talking pretty high resolution there. So that's, I hope that answers your question, but yeah. Like it's entirely about temporal coverage, and it's entirely about making sure geographically you can actually cover the areas you wish to cover. And most of those higher resolution, incredibly high resolution satellites, they're called pinholes as like their secondary name, and it's because they're literally like just a tiny hole that like you can imagine. Take a straw and like look through it, and that's basically all the swath you'll see from one of those high resolution satellites. You have to be very precise at targeting what you're looking at. It's not broad-based geographic coverage. So yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting take on like what are the resolution of images and dataset available online, and just for the audience, like if they want to experiment and see, play around with the datasets. So when you say that Atlas is a PBC, so I know about the research because I've seen the research produced by Atlas. It's available online, and I've read a couple of them. And so, what about the dataset? Does Atlas release some cleaned or organized dataset, or is there anything available that anyone can look into and perform some analysis or extraction or anything on that?
Yeah, for sure. And I don't want to turn this into a sales pitch, but because this is a data sciencey podcast, happy to go into it a little bit. So a big part of what Atlas does is it tries to create derivative data set layers and also aggregate layers as well, right? So a lot of times you'll have information. Let's take into account electrification infrastructure, right? For anyone who's trying to understand what areas of the given world are electrified, pretty easy in the developed world. All you really need to do is go to like your nearest public utility and hopefully like, make a phone call to the GIS department, and all of a sudden, boom, you've got like, information about the public grid. You've got information on like, at least general information, how many households are connected, how much power utilization is happening, blah, 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 right? Like most utilities that are publicly owned will give you this information because they're in the they're in a public domain. But when you're operating in areas where that's not the case, or you don't just have one giant utility doing so, or that one giant utility is operating in a language that's different than yours, right? Like how are you going to talk to the Kenya Power and Light Company and get that data? Will the Kenya Power and Light Company even give you that information, for example, right? So in that situation, you got to go through other angles. What's the best angle that we can use? Night lights. Well, if you can detect with a sensor during nighttime, if there's lighting on the ground, it's rest assured acceptable that there's electricity there. So that's the approach that like started being taken probably about 10-ish years ago to try to better understand, electrification infrastructure. Problem is nightlight data tends to be pretty quite coarse, at least what's available in the public domain. And commercially available nightlight data is a little tricky to get with geographic coverage, kind of the way what Arsh was mentioning earlier. So it doesn't even matter if it's Africa or United States, like it's just sometimes really tricky to procure non-public nightlight data. So how do you do it? You take a bunch of these images that just show you the relative luminosity, right? How bright a given area is on the ground. It looks kind of boring. It just looks like a black image with a bunch of white spots and a bunch of gradients. But then you're able to ascertain, if you look at the actual values underneath the pixels luminosity, how bright a given area is, or if you've been taking multiple observations, how consistently bright the luminosity is. Sometimes like it might dim down, sometimes it might go up. That's going to give you information about reliability of electricity access on the ground. So what we do is we interpret a lot of this nightlight data. We work with school institutions as well that have done this interpretation, and we standardize the entire stack, right? And you make it so that temporally speaking, you're able to understand things on a monthly basis across the entire continent of Africa as to which areas are electrified and which areas are not. And we can take it one step further. Sorry, go ahead.
Like taking a mean of the couple of observations.
And couple is definitely the lower way to put it, but yes, for sure.
I mean, more than that.
Absolutely. I know what you were saying. I was just joshing you. But yeah, so that's one way to think about it. The other side is, let's take it a step further. Let's try to, it's great, I think, sometimes to understand where a given area is electrified and where it is not. But sometimes you need to understand who is electrified and how many people are electrified. And so how can you do weighting of that electrification data set with population information? So assume that you were able to understand population data not based on an average across a district with a bunch of pixels that you see, but rather you're kind of narrowing the counts to where you notice buildings and settlements. Well, once you know that information, it's pretty easy to understand how to do the population weighted adjustments in order to understand who and how many people are actually, not even who, because we're not identifying people, how many people and where are the people that have gotten electrification infrastructure or not, right? So this is important information for anyone who's trying to build like an off-grid solar plant for like a village. This is important for anyone who's trying to understand, hey, I'm trying to make sure that I expand the grid to at least another 10 kilometers from where it is. Okay, where are the areas of my focus that I need to do, right? So that those are the kinds of problem statements that need to be solved. In any of those situations, the last thing you want to do is have your own team that is pulling in satellite data and then coalescing all this information and then somehow coming up with the answer of, oh, here. Or no, there, right? You want someone who's just a service provider and a SaaS service provider, right? That has a product that has already done this work for you. And so, in the most crude sense, we are a platform that has done a variety of different data sets in not just in digital format, but in aggregations that matter in terms of use cases. To take it a few steps beyond that, we want to work on use cases that actually can include workflows that we can take care of. So, what are the next steps you're going to do once you've identified that these are the 7 areas of focus for you? Well, in that case, I need to go and make sure that like I work with my team and we do these things, we prioritize these regions, and we try to collect information around like, what's the relative ability for a given community to pay for electricity or something like that. Great. Well, we're going to work on economic consumption data to make sure that like that's another thing we can answer for you, right? Like that's the way like this works. Is our product is supposed to answer as many questions as we can about the problem statements that you have. And then we're more than happy to make sure the data sets are actually interoperable so that you can export them from our side and pull them into any other model that you have on your side or any other GIS platform or anything as well.
Interesting.
Is it open source? Is it like open to everyone?
Some of it is, some of it isn't. So a big part of what's challenging in operating in Africa is survey data just doesn't come easy. And so we sometimes have partner institutions that are financial institutions, lenders on continent that give us anonymized data on understanding, what's going on with like who's borrowed money for what crop or things like that. There's also a variety of survey data that's just a lot harder to get. So think like census data sets, but a lot more unique than census data sets, and the ability to actually work with that data and to parse through it and process it is something that like we go through. So some data is open source for sure, and it's a good thing that it's open source. And then other data sets are proprietary to us just because it's very cumbersome and hard to actually get like field survey information.
Interesting. So yeah, I mean, that's a very deep and insightful look into what Atlas does and what kind of data set they handle with and what kind of revenue and market do it have. I do have like a question when it comes to my mind that Atlas tries to take the step into emerging markets. So when we say emerging markets, like what do you mean here? Like, does this mean developing countries, or does this mean countries who are very poor, or like?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I imagine I'm going to piss off some economist somewhere by saying anything I say. So that's a full blanket, like hopefully caveat insurance policy statement I can make there. There are a ton of definitions out there around what is considered an emerging economy, what's considered an emerging market, what's considered frontier market. I'm going to speak in generalities, and then I will kind of go into like maybe one or two specifics without getting into too much trouble. I think back in the day, you had this connotation of first world countries, second world countries, third world countries. And everyone almost always assumes that like that means, oh, first world's the most developed, second world's like sort of developing, third world is like, oh, super poor. And in reality, it was much more of a geopolitical connotation than anything else. It was like first world countries are like open democracies that happen to have a decent amount of economic development, and then like second world is like those that are less so democracies, more socialist or more communist, and might have some like things, and then third world is like countries that are trying to figure out like what to do or something. Like that's kind of how it all started out, if I'm not mistaken. Again, anyone can prove me wrong on that one, and I'm happy to be accepted as being proven wrong. But if I understand the developed world, emerging market, frontier market connotation is a lot more economic and a lot less geopolitical, right? So developed means developed. You have a fairly good, human development index rating. You have a fairly good set of GDP growth that's been happening year over year. And you've been exhibiting characteristics of a diversified economy that's not relying on just a single natural resource or something like that. And you have been a like stable economy for like some period of time. So that like gives you kind of the thumbs up, right? I think there's a whole bunch of other things related to like monetary policy and fiscal policy that go into there too. Or do you have a fiat currency, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to get into that because that's not my field, and I'm just going to get into trouble. The second part is emerging markets, and the easiest way I think people have been talking about emerging economies for the last 20 years has been with BRIC, I believe is the acronym, which is like Brazil, Russia, India, China. Sometimes they add a K at the end for South Korea. In the 90s and like late 80s, it was the Asian tigers, right? So you have like Taiwan, again, South Korea, you had Singapore, you had Japan. That was kind of really, booming during that era. And I guess roughly, if you want to count Hong Kong in that, I guess you can do that too, but maybe we'll get into trouble because it's part of China now. Who knows? Whatever. But like that's at least how people had kind of been as a proxy understanding emerging markets. And then frontier markets are like markets that like have a ton of untapped potential, definitely a huge market, but there isn't enough infrastructure there to actually go and expand with products or services, or there's no at scale possibility to do foreign direct investment, or even if capital was available, you don't know where to apply that capital. And so like things are just less clear. And also your risk on return of investment is also a lot higher. And so those are considered, I believe, frontier markets, if I'm not mistaken. Again, these are rough generalities. Please, any economist that listens to this, don't get me in trouble. I'm trying to do the best here. But that's kind of the context, right? I think your original question was like, why focus on emerging markets or frontier markets? Was that correct?
No, my question was like, what would be the emerging markets? Like when you say Atlas focuses on emerging markets, like is it a particular geographical region in a country, or is it a whole country, or like what?
Oh, yeah, got it. Yeah. So normally we think countrywide when we think emerging markets or frontier markets, right? Sometimes even regionally, so sub-Saharan Africa versus like Western Africa, things like that. But for the purposes of what we do, right, there's a ton of diversity, economically speaking, culturally speaking, monetarily speaking, across Africa, right? And while you can generally assume that there's significant economic inequality in any African country, some countries tend to do better than others. And so, operating in South Africa as like one of our customers is very different than operating in Uganda, for example, right? Operating in Egypt up in the north, very different than operating in Somalia, right? Just in the East. And so that's kind of the context here. I think there's a whole bunch of colonial things that go into this as well. But in the broadest sense, there are markets in Africa that are more deemed emerging, and there are markets that are deemed frontier just because they're just now, I think, opening up for enough foreign direct investment where immediate knowledge of the market and cultural knowledge is not the like only requirement, but is one of the requirements that like you need to have, right? So for us, all of our data sets for now tend to be continent wide. And like we want to keep it that way. We're not trying to make it so that we have way more data for Nigeria and therefore like Nigeria is our focus. We try to make sure any data set that we generate, we can do it continent wide. And if there, for example, is a lower confidence score as a measure of that in certain countries, we'll be honest about it. We're like, hey, we're really good in these like 20 countries, we're in these countries, and we're sort of in these countries. And so feel free to adjust the weights of how you use our data, but this data is frankly a lot better than no data. And so please do that. And it's not so much that like the R-squared metrics that we use are like completely unreliable or something. And only in a handful of cases would we see that like the data sets we generate deviate significantly from like what's considered like generally accepted data sets out there right now. So like it happens in one or two countries here or there, but for the most part, our data sets are fairly reliable and clearly are used by a lot of different reputable customers as well. But yeah, so that's kind of the distinction between frontier market and emerging market. As you expand globally, that's important too.
Yeah.
It's been
Yeah,
really
interesting.
interesting
Like,
hearing about what Atlas does. Yeah, I agree. So I wanted to ask you something. It's also related to Atlas, but like different from what we have been discussing. So you are head of product at Atlas, right?
Correct.
So we are all aware of like jokes and memes in the software world that like every software developer hates their manager. And I'm sure you are the best manager there that can be. So like I wanted to ask you what what do you do to break that stereotype? Like how do you manage your team in a way that like they like you?
That's okay. That's fair. I've been on both sides of that. I've been on the technical side as well. Like
so
I hate my
just
account manager.
just yeah, just
Yeah.
before you start answering this question, so last night me and Rush were just planning a rough outline, and I was totally on your side. I said
Oh,
Deven
really?
is a very good manager, so I vouched for you. So you already
Thanks,
have
man.
one
I
point in your
appreciate
side.
it. All right, now the pressure
Yeah.
is built to maintain that entire
Yeah.
credibility. Yeah, so I think there's a fundamentally nuanced question there, Arsh, which is like what makes for a good general manager when you're working with technical teams. I'm in the unique position where I'm not just a product manager, meaning like someone who independently operates separate of an engineering team, but works directly with them in order to like get something out the door. But I also happen to be kind of like their temporary engineering manager as well, right? So I am a people manager for them, and I am a customer of theirs as a product manager. Very unique situation where I have to constantly negotiate against myself, and it's not a fun position to be in. And hopefully, we will soon be changing that at the company as we, grow from a hiring standpoint. But the real answer that I can provide to you as honestly as I can is depending on the team that you work on, depending on the company size, we're a pretty small company. So let's imagine Atlas, which is about 16 people right now, going to like call it, mid to late 20 size by the end of this year. And let's take an example like Planet Labs, which when I joined was like 130 people and is now probably 400, 500 people. And then let's take an account like, I don't know, some like mid-size enterprise company that's about 2,000 people, right? Like Enterprise Inc., right? Just as like the comparison. I think you're going to find different flavors of managers at each of these companies. In my case, it would be very bad if I was not technical in any way, shape, or form. If I was just someone who was drafting product requirements and then kind of asking my team to get things done, why is this taking so long, without really being able to dive into the nuances, I would suck as a particular product manager at a company that is as technical as ours at a stage that we're in. But I'm actually going to channel a colleague and a dear friend of mine. His name's Arun Mohan, from India. He is currently the head of product for Credit Karma's home product. They're credit scores and credit card products and lending products are huge in the United States, and so the leading company here that manages all of that is called Credit Karma. And so one of their businesses is the home division. They help you understand what your credit scores are like now and what kind of mortgage or home loan you can qualify for, and also sometimes ties you with different providers as well. So the guy who runs product for that team, he gave a talk recently at the product school, and I love the fact that he actually put down into words all the discussions all of us would have over happy hour or drinks or something over the last few years, which means there are different kinds of managers, right? And it's totally okay to have different flavors. You can be a technical, in the case of product, you can be a technical product manager. And that means you came from the software engineering background. And so your skill sets and strengths are around truly understanding technical architecture, being able to work with platform teams, data science teams. You can be a business-oriented product manager that doesn't have that many technical skills. I think the hope is you grow some, but that means that you truly understand how to commercialize something. You understand and can empathize and put yourself in the mindset of your customer, what they're going to feel when they receive something that an engineering team has built. You can be a UX PM, which comes from a design standpoint, meant for specific roles, but that's totally an acceptable way to be a product manager. And then, I forgot what the last one was. I think it was you can be a people PM, where your job is to kind of be the peacemaker, right? And different stages of companies and different sizes of companies require the diversity of those kinds of PMs. Sometimes as a product manager, you need to play multiple roles of the four that I just mentioned. And in my case, you can add that I'm also a temporary engineering manager as well. So you ask how do I get my engineering team to like me? Sometimes they don't like me very much. I think we're very respectful of each other. We're very civil. We're very diplomatic with each other. And we understand that anytime if I was to express frustration or if I was to communicate why I would like to, make sure we step on the gas to accomplish something, it's done in earnest and it's coming from a good place. It's not showing any animosity or anything. So just being a good person, I think, is pretty important. But then on top of that, it helps that I come from a technical background. It helps that when an engineer of mine says that, oh, it's actually hard to do this because authentication is one thing, but we got to make sure the tokens actually are validated appropriately, and therefore we can't expose this API out right now, but we can do it for internal systems and services. If that sounded like gibberish to anyone that was in my position, I would be a terrible PM for this stage of the company. As the company grows, as different units need to be formed, that's fine, as long as you understand at the end of that, hey, this means things will be delayed, and you got to manage expectations with your end users, whether that's your bosses or anybody else outside. So I hope, and my hope is that as we grow and as we build this team out, that we are able to hire the same kind of like-minded people that are respectful to others, people that are not trying to sound smarter than they are. In fact, I love that most of the times I'm the dumbest person in the room. I like operating that way. I like asking 1.5 million times, am I correct in assuming blah, 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 blah? Because I'd rather be stupid when I'm asking something and someone corrects me in a conversation than 4 months down the line, we're about to roll something out. And I'm like, wait, why isn't this feature done? It's like, wait, what feature? And that's when the confusion happens. No one wants that to happen. So that's kind of the goal here. I would say it's still a learning process for anyone who's in my position. No one should at all ever say that they're an expert at being a good manager or a good PM. It's a learning exercise. And as long as you can stay humble, I think, and you're a good person, I think you can be a good manager. Sorry,
Yeah,
long-winded, but hopefully that.
I agree. So I agree that managers sometimes need to push the team to move the project forward. And sorry to put you on the spot, but yeah, I can hear in your justification that I would love working with you. You are you sound really serious and dedicated to running a good team.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Hopefully my team thinks that too.
Yeah. So I see a question in the chat, and I'm also personally really like curious about this. So Prakhar mentions that he works with government data, and usually it's like not really nice and really badly formatted and missing a lot of stuff. So he was asking how much of this process is automated. Like, as I assume the same is true for Africa, even more so. Like the data is not in good shape. So how much of it is like automated?
Yeah, so I think for now, for the team size that we're at, some things that need to be automated will be automated just because we don't have the bandwidth and people to do like manual ETL or like to be able to do like unique cleanups for every single type of data that we have. So everything goes into a data lake, and then for the most common data sets that tend to be ingested on a routine basis, there's like pipelines that are built out so that we can process that data, sift through it, and grab the most important metadata and store it into a different database that's fully structured and is more immediately queryable. So that's one aspect of it. But I think the other side of it is we don't automate things completely just for the sake of automation. I think we also don't have that luxury, right? So we don't have a team that's like a data wrangling team whose job it is to basically take a whole bunch of public domain data, sort through it, sift through it, and make it, super accessible across the board. As and when needed, if we need to build a pipeline around something because it's a data set we continually need to access, we will do that. In terms of like the accessibility of data that comes through from the African continent, you're right that a lot of times it's not good. I think sometimes when I'm just going through and trying to find different data sets, I'll find a PDF file and I'm like, oh God, like this is not going to be fun. And sometimes, you'll find that like the CSV comes with a bunch of characters that were encoded incorrectly, and it's practically useless, right? So even if there was a good faith effort to post the data publicly and to get people to use it, if it's not formatted correctly, or if the encoding's off and special characters turn into weird squares, how do you even try to interpret what's going on, even if you try to move from like UTF-8 to ISO or whatever? So there are like little weird nuances like that. I think an interesting thing is this is not unique to just the developing world. At Planet, I was working in the energy sector, and that was kind of like the business that like I was in charge of growing for Planet. And one of the things that we needed to do was understand where in the state of Texas, just as an example, which is in the United States, just for the record, where in the state of Texas have there been drilling activity ongoing for either crude oil or natural gas? Simple question. I think there are some places where you can find that information now that are easily accessible. I believe there's Enigma. I believe that stores like generally publicly available information in their like public version of their thing. So that's interesting. And none of that was actually available. So what do you actually need to do to get that data? This is in the developed world. This is in Texas, which, by the way, if it was its own country, would be like the 6th largest economy on the planet, or 11th or something like that, some large economy. And you have to call someone at the city of Austin, which is the state capital, and you have to talk to someone in the state capital's GIS department, pay them $3,000 in a non-PCI compliant way over the phone. Hopefully they've gotten like a credit card form now. And then they'll give you a giant, like, 2 to 3 gigabyte file, but they don't just give it to you. They give you temporary, not even SFTP, FTP access to this data, right? So like, this is not the most like secure operation that's being run, but also like how frequently is someone asking for like drill rig data, right? So like, in a way you can understand it, but then also the other thing is, why is the Texas Railroad Commission in charge of like all of these different permits for like oil and gas drilling? That also doesn't make any sense, but that's just like a figment of like, this is hard to get. Once I got the data, it was in ASCII format. It had a series of numbers that were its like legend breaks and reference breaks for, so like anything that was like 14 space and then a number was latitude, I think, if I remember correctly. And anything that was like 15 as the reference, space, and then a number was the longitude. But like all of this was in weird ASCII format. If I looked at the data structure and I was trying to figure out what's going on, they gave me a PDF file with it, and they didn't actually even give me the data structure. They literally used characters like pipes, stars, and slashes to draw boxes and to like connect the things. And it was like, how did someone do it? And I thought this was like a file from like 1985 or something like that. No, last updated 2018. And I'm like, what is going on here? Like, I don't understand. So yeah, needless to say, like trying to put that into a pandas data frame, trying to make sure you can sort through it, was a massive pain in the ass. And it actually got my computer, which was a MacBook Pro at the time, and my friend's computer, which was a like Lenovo, like ThinkPad, like whatever, like fancy, whatever thing, running Windows. And both of our computers were not able to process through this 2 gigabyte ASCII file. You know what was able to do so without using NumPy or anything else? Microsoft freaking Excel. Within 5 minutes, I had exactly the 2 columns that I wanted, which was a lat long, and it was able to pass through everything. And I exported it as an XLSX and as a CSV file. I'm like, oh God. And then I put it into QGIS, which is like the open source GIS tool, to figure out if the data set actually made sense. And thankfully it made sense, but yeah, it just to give you an idea of like, it's not just in Africa or call it India that like where working with data sucks. It can also be in America.
Yeah, they probably even built that data set in Excel itself.
Maybe. I have no idea. I think a lot of these operations tend to have like old school geodatabases from like back in the day, and then they try to, instead of using a proprietary format, just go for like as flat of a file as possible or something. So
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, everywhere there's some funny stories or, nuances that we can't miss. Like people in India used to think like data sets from US would be top class. Like it's not the case.
I mean, yeah, it depends, right? Like I think it's, some data is super awesome to work with. Like I think the old CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, when he left Microsoft, he created something like usafacts.org or something like that. I forgot what he actually created, but something like that. And it was trying to help the civic, he was trying to do it like as a civic duty, to say like, get people to truly understand how the government spends money, makes money, and what it does with like the resources. And then also what are the metrics that are important to track. He did that entirely with publicly accessible data that is stored on data.gov, right? And this was done in like the early 2010s, mid 2000s, right when like Satya Nadella was taking on. And so in that situation, it was pretty easy for like an engineering team, I imagine, of like 20 people to coalesce the entirety of how the United States spends money, makes money, what the different labor statistics are, commercial statistics are, what is like voting patterns across the United States, precinct information. So all of that data was stored well, structured well, accessible, and is still pretty accessible. Like I think since Obama, there's been a huge effort to do data.gov as a way to get as much federal data sets that were in federal databases to be structured in a way that is publicly accessible with like a README file to give you explicit and clear instructions. And now the military is a part of it too. So if you go to like the dod.mil GitHub page, you'll get like a bunch of data sets that like the military has been collecting for like decades. If you go to the nga.mil GitHub page, which is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, you'll get a bunch of data sets of like imagery and things that they've been collecting for a long time, right? So like it's all stuff that's been declassified, obviously, not like, military information, but like they're doing a serious job. And I'd say, funny enough, like even during the Trump administration, they were doing a pretty decent job of like trying to get this data to be as useful and accessible as possible until, politics got in the way, but let's not talk about that.
Yeah. So just to wrap up the discussion about Atlas, I have one question for you, and which goes something like, you are like head of the product at Atlas, and I've seen and I've seen and I've interacted with you earlier that Atlas affects like 3 to 5% of GDP of a country in which they're
Wait,
operating.
wait. What did you just say?
3 to 5% GDP of that country by
Atlas affects 3 to 5% of the GDP?
by telling the government to make decisions which would affect them.
I wouldn't be, I would be a lot more modest than that. I don't even want to like claim a number. I think what I'd say is there are large programs that are government sponsored in the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars that are affected and also directed as a course of AtlasAI data. I wouldn't say like a single-digit percentage of a country's GDP is affected because of AtlasAI just yet. That would be so awesome for me to claim the next time I'm on this podcast with you, though.
Okay, so let me rephrase the question. So let's just say you are basically in the seat where you have power to make decision, and you can affect the decision of the government, which could potentially affect the lives of people living over there. So
yeah, that's totally fair. Yes.
Yeah, I think okay. Yeah, because I saw the GDP thing on the website of Atlas. That's why I was curious about that. But yeah, anyways, so yeah, I was just wondering, like, has there been a situation in your journeys with Atlas that there was a moral obligation, or a place where you were being tested? So should I release this feature or not? Is it gonna affect the people in bad way or wrong way? And
That's a good question. I don't think we've had that issue here at Atlas just yet. We're also fairly young in our journey, so I think I'm lucky to be able to say something like that, where we haven't had that issue, because most of the work we've been taking on is with institutions that, like, one, have validated us and we've validated them, but two, it's entirely work that's mission driven to the cause of this company, right? Of course, you can imagine as we start to hire more corporates, or not hire, but like onboard more corporates and onboard like a lot of different institutions, that like there might be a different purpose for why they want this granular economic data or something, right? Like, I can't imagine a world where this is the case, but like, because we would be the most ineffective way to do this. But let's play out this hypothetical. Like, someone wants access to our electrification infrastructure data so that they can understand explicitly where, like, they can superimpose that with like political voting patterns to, figure out, okay, which areas of the city or town do I need to, like, remove the electricity out because they didn't vote for me or something, right? Like, these types of things happen in the African continent. We are probably the worst way for someone to affect that kind of negative change, because that information is way more readily available by you just having political influence with a local like power utility company or something like that, or you can just pick up the phone and say like, hey, like, turn off electricity for this part of town because they didn't vote for me or something. But like, those types of situations are things I'm sure we will run into sooner rather than later, right? I think we're lucky in the sense that like we are two layers protected from that type of a moral dilemma, whereas like I'd say Planet was like one layer protected, right? So that question is way more relevant for Planet, where there was an ethics committee, right? And there had to be an ethics committee to understand. Now, how that ethics committee like performed and like what the results were sometimes still needs like improvement. But the intention there was to make sure Planet Labs was not going to go into a commercial engagement with an institution or with an entity that was just contrary to the mission for why Planet was founded. Right, like, end of story. And if that meant a sacrifice in revenue, then it meant a sacrifice in revenue, but we would manage expectations with our investors. And unless like things were so dire that like, we literally needed like, that $500,000 contract or something, which there are worse problems for Planet if it really needs a $500,000 contract, because their like quarterly burn rate is like many times that in terms of like expenditures for staff and for building satellites and stuff. But the intention was, well, we manage expectations. And so there was a case where I think the South Sudanese wanted to procure data for a purpose or something, or we found out through a proxy that this data was going to go to the South Sudanese government. Something happened with South Sudan. I'm not sure what happened. And I think there was just enough apprehension for providing data to the institution that requested it. Again, I'm not sure if it was the SATS and news government themselves or it was somebody that was a proxy for them. And while it technically did not violate any export control laws that the United States has, the planet was like, yeah, we're not going to do this deal. Like, we're just going to forfeit the revenue here. So there have been cases where something like that has occurred. And I think a lot of companies that are in this kind of space, no pun intended, do tend to have an ethics committee in many ways. There are a lot of space companies that are established defense contractors will probably not have that ethics committee. Or if they do, it's entirely from a regulatory and compliance standpoint of, hey, let's not get into trouble with like these 5 governments that pay for like, 40% of our revenue. So let's make sure that like from a regulatory and compliance standpoint that like we're not just taking money from everyone. But I have a feeling, like, and this is, and no shade to them. Like, that's their business and that's what they do, and they're defense contractors. That's just not our business, and that's not how we should operate. Again, I'm lucky to be able to say we haven't had that issue just yet, but I hope we don't run into that.
I think maybe near future, but yeah, that's just like a heads up for you. So yeah, I mean, I think we have covered almost not on everything, but yeah, a lot of good stuff about Atlas and all. So you and I, we had our conversations regarding geopolitics and stuff when we used to have chat, and I know you're pretty interested in that. So I kind of like picked a very recent topic for that, and so I think everyone in the audience and you are familiar with the Suez Canal incident that happened a few weeks ago. And yeah, fortunately, the ship is not there. I mean, the route is clear now. So I was just wondering, like, what are your thoughts about that incident, and how much do you think the world has made it? Because there's something like this happened. Something like this happens. There are memes floating everywhere on Reddit, Twitter, and all. And obviously there's been a huge loss. Like I read about some numbers, and it was around something $9 billion or something like that. That's a pretty huge number in terms of like money. So what do you think about that? And do you think like they could have solved the problem earlier, or is there anything that you would like to share with us?
I'd say the general observations I made were, I think a couple of commentators came through saying that like there was a priority to create a parallel track for the Suez Canal just for this type of a situation, so that like literally there'll be a secondary like Suez Canal for a decent portion of it, so that in case something like this happened, like you always have a second channel through which you can move goods and services, that it's not just completely blocked. But it did actually. There's ramifications on doing that, right? Like you have to purchase right of way, people's farmland gets taken. Like there's a whole like set of implications, right? There's even implications for how the first Suez Canal was built and what it really went to actually make that happen, right? Like that's engineering on a different level, and it's impressive, but also there were ethical ramifications there too.
Exactly.
So I think that's a nuanced side of the situation. Economically and memes wise speaking, actually, let's do memes first. This was, I think, without intending, Planet's shining moment over the last like 2 months. Every single meme I saw, I'm like, wait a minute, like I know exactly what that image looks like. And like having stared at Planet satellite data for so long, for so many years, it's almost like I know what Planet satellite imagery looks like. And I'm like, that offset for that blue looks very particularly similar to what I'm used to. Is that Planet data? And sure enough, I go to the Planet Twitter account, and it's the same image that like was posted by Planet Labs. And like all the memes that you probably saw, call it like 85% of them, you use Planet imagery. So it was like, it's like when you like there was one meme that I saw. It's like, when you think you're doing really bad at work, just know that like there's always someone who has it worse than you. And it just showed like the evergreen. And yeah, we can laugh about it now. You're right, there was significant economic damage. I'd say my main thoughts on this are, there is a fragility to the global economy that I think we just sometimes take for granted. It's everything from the infrastructure that we have on ground for electrification to, like, you know, actual shipping channels like the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. And to keep things operating requires the diligence and coordination of a ton of people that are clearly not paid nearly enough to do the job that they're doing, right? Like that's really my largest observation here. I don't even want to know what was the pay structure for every single person that was in the excavator that was trying to dig the ship out of trouble, right? I don't even want to talk about the whole, like, oh, we're going to keep this boat hostage until, like, Evergreen Shipping or whatever the Taiwanese company is pays us like X billion dollars for, like, damage and things. Yeah, like there's just I think it talks to me about stark economic inequality and how the people that will be the end beneficiaries of the cargo that was on that ship and their relative purchasing power to the staff that was in charge of unblocking that ship and making it go, right? Sure, the ship captain probably gets paid decent, maybe the crew gets paid decently, but does the ground crew on the Suez Canal really get paid roughly the same amount? Was 2x overtime, if that's a thing, right? Like getting paid overtime is actually going to give them nearly the money to offset the time they spent away from their family, right? Assuming they are close to their family physically and proximity wise, right? So, like, those are the, like, things I think about from a geopolitical standpoint. I think operating in Africa definitely opens your eyes to just the amount of things we take for granted and the basic infrastructure that we've come to just accept as, like, oh, flip a switch, electricity's on, like, move on with my day. Sometimes, you know, like, you know, I don't know if you were a kid or when you were a kid, if your parents yelled at you because you left the light on for too long. And, like, think about the luxury of being able to just, like, worry about an electricity bill, but not, like, a lack of electricity, right? Like,
Exactly.
and so, like, those are the kinds of things I start thinking about. But I'm going to stop here before we go way too white space.
This so this does, you know, bring the things in perspective and everything. I think everyone in life needs perspective. That's how we grow and that's how we learn things. So yeah, like, I think, Arsh, please.
Yeah, so we are getting pretty close to like closing time, and it wouldn't be a podcast if I didn't ask you a fun question. So I've heard a lot from Sanket about you that you love to talk about space, right? And me
Yeah, yep.
personally, I also love talking about space, and like I can talk about it for hours. But I have like two questions for you, and I would let you pick which one you want to answer. So, do you want to talk about Mars or aliens?
um, let's talk about Mars.
So, yeah, so my question is, if Elon Musk calls you tomorrow and tells you he has the last seat available on a shuttle to Mars, and it's a one-way trip, and you are like you have a fully paid ticket on that shuttle, would you go, like, on a
Nope.
one-way trip? No.
Nope.
So
Nope.
why?
Yeah. um, yeah, like these are, like, very interesting thoughts that we would constantly have in the Planet Office over a happy hour. Like, what would get you to leave Earth? I think, um, like, a lot of times, the desire to explore is there in my mind, but I also am someone who appreciates a basic level of, like, creature comforts. So Wi-Fi, two-ply toilet paper or a bidet, and making sure that there's hot water available. If those three, I can sleep on a flat, cold concrete floor, no problem. But I better have access to a hot shower after I've woken up. But yeah, so
What if you
just
have
for
Wi-Fi
the
on Mars, but it's still one way?
Well, but the problem is like it's a physics problem at that point, right? Like to communicate to anyone on Earth would take me 20 minutes just to say like hello, or rather 14 minutes, I think is the actual situation. 7 minutes there, 7 minutes back. And I mean, we might like yell about like, you know, Zoom latency here being off by 3 seconds, but like there's a real problem when you've got like 7 minute latency. And I'm just not comfortable with that, man. It would really need to be that there has to be more than enough entertainment, more than enough like localized source of exploration and fun on Mars. Actually, this is probably the best segue into what makes a frontier market, and what makes an emerging market an emerging market. Sorry to make it dumb
Yeah,
and
Mars is
like
like the
boring.
ultimate frontier, right?
Yeah, no, and actually, if I was to recommend a TV show, because I guess maybe that could be the other segue here, at the end of a classic podcast, The Expanse, probably one of the best TV shows I've ever seen. I think Sanket and I have even talked about it before. I don't know if you watch it or not, but like, I believe season 4 of The Expanse, or season 5, I don't know which one. They start dealing with this because they're now traveling to. They figured out a way. I'm not going to spoil anything. They figured out a way to not just transport themselves between the solar system and like dealing with the geopolitical issues here or space political issues here, or astropolitical issues, I guess would be the term there. I don't know. And they now can go into different worlds. And well, like what happens when on Earth or on Mars there is an official license given to a particular corporation to be able to do mining on a planet so far away where there is no like official government jurisdiction? Does that contract even hold, right? Those are the things that interest me. And I feel like, you know, being that frontier is not that fun, right? Like I think I would love to go visit Mars. In fact, I want to go to the moon, man. Like that would be great. Like take me to the moon and bring me back to Earth. Be able to see Earth from far away, grab that perspective. Like that would be fun. Yeah, but Mars is more of like I'm glad people are going. I'm not going to go, and I know there's tons of people that would stand in that line and would take Elon's call to go to Mars for sure. So to infinity and beyond for them.
Yeah. So Arsh, I want to ask you this question. What are your thoughts on this? Would you go or not?
I haven't decided yet to cheap out. What I'm
Oh,
doing is
okay.
collecting everyone else's opinion on whether they would go or not, and then once I have enough like in quotes training data, then I would decide.
Yeah.
Make
That's
sure
how
you don't overfit.
that's how we work at PyData, collect data and make decisions. So yeah, I think like we are above our time, our stipulated time. I think we aimed for around 60 minutes or so for our first episode. But yeah, it's been fun. Like, what do you think, Deven?
Yeah, no, this has been great. Yeah, always a fun time chatting with you, Sanket, and happy to do it again. Hopefully next time I can actually claim that AtlasAI affected 3 to 5% of a country's GDP.
It's on the website. I saw it yesterday. It's like 2 to 3% or something like that.
I'm gonna have to figure out what to change on the website.
Yeah, yeah, it's been fun, and thanks Arsh for being my executive producer. I know he hates the word, but yeah, I would like to give the title to you. And thanks, Devin, for joining us. And thanks everyone for joining us. And so just before we close for tonight, this is actually a new way we are trying to experiment with online meetups, and so because I don't think so. I don't think we will be having physical meetups this year. So just having presentations and workshops, we kind of thought like peeking behind the curtain and see like what our guests and speakers that we have interacted in the past think about different thoughts, and how do they do their thing, or how do they manage big teams, and how do they solve problem, and yeah, if they want to go to Mars or not. Yeah. So yeah, and hopefully we'll catch up with all of you again next month, and till then, take care, stay safe, and stay home. All right, goodbye.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody.